Welcome to another episode of China Update, where I provide you with the most up-to-date political, economic, and geostrategic analysis on the world's number 2 economy. My name is Tony. Let's jump in. Okay, happy Wednesday, everybody. First up, we take note of two important updates related to US-China relations. In recent days, the two sides held the 5th meeting of the Financial Working Group set up after US Secretary of the Treasury, Janet Yellen's visit to China last year. After the sit-down, the People's Bank of China said the meeting in Shanghai produced an agreement with the US Treasury to appoint contact people to deal with any future, quote, financial stress events, end quote. The central bank readout added, quote, the People's Bank of China and the US Treasury Department signed an exchange of notes on strengthening China-US financial stability cooperation, end quote. It said the countries also, quote, exchanged lists of financial stability contacts, end quote. The talks represented the first sit-down between senior US and Chinese economic officials since Beijing's leadership laid out its longer-term priorities last month at the third plenum. A US Treasury spokesperson said the Shanghai meeting focused on topics including macroeconomic and financial stability, governance of the International Monetary Fund, and capital market issues. The second development to take note of today is much more concerning. US-based New York Times reports that back in March, US President Biden approved, quote, a highly classified nuclear strategic plan for the United States that, for the first time, reorients America's deterrent strategy to focus on China's rapid expansion in its nuclear arsenal. End quote. The shift in the PRC's nuclear strategy under Xi Jinping has been an area of surprise and concern among many analysts. We remember last month, Carnegie senior analyst Tong Zhao warned in a long report we covered at the time, quote, contemporary Chinese leaders, particularly Xi Jinping, have elevated the political importance of nuclear weapons. Coupled with significant changes in China's domestic political system in recent years, this has led to a nuclear policy that is less cohesive, less coherent, and less aligned with China's specific security requirements than before. These complex political dynamics remain largely ignored by international policymakers and analysts. End quote. This New York Times report suggests that the US administration is, however, becoming increasingly concerned. The New York Times writes that the White House never announced that Biden had approved the revised strategy called the Nuclear Employment Guidance, which also newly seeks to prepare the United States for possible coordinated nuclear challenges from China, Russia, and North Korea. The document, updated every 4 years or so, is so highly classified that there are no electronic copies, only a small number of hard copies distributed to a few national security officials and Pentagon commanders. But in recent speeches, the outlet writes, 2 senior administration officials were allowed to allude to the change. Quote, the country's nuclear expansion is running at an even faster pace than American intelligence officials anticipated 2 years ago, driven by President Xi Jinping's determination to scrap the decades-long strategy of maintaining a minimum deterrent to reach or exceed the size of Washington's and Moscow's arsenals. China's nuclear complex is now the fastest growing in the world. End quote. The Biden strategy, writes the Times, sharpens that focus to reflect the Pentagon's estimates that China's nuclear force would expand to 1,000 by 2030 and 1,500 by 2035, roughly the numbers that the United States and Russia now deploy. In fact, Beijing now appears ahead of that schedule, officials say, and has begun loading nuclear missiles into new silo fields that were spotted by commercial satellites 3 years ago. Next up, recently US-based Rhodium Group published a long report called A Diversification Framework for China. The report argues that Western policymakers and business leaders are rethinking over-reliance on China as a global manufacturing and sourcing hub. The first question is whether diversification from China is even possible, given the economies of scale and scope China's huge size has permitted. They find that diversification is already taking place to a limited but important degree. Quote, shocks from the US-China trade war, COVID, Russia's war on Ukraine, and other events have made the risks of hyper-globalized value chains clear, altering the valuation of those risks in business and policy planning. And tensions with China continue to rise as a function of technological change, even as political authorities seek stabilization. End quote. The authors define diversification as, quote, shifting commercial activity, trade, investment, research and development, R&D, employees, etc., away from China to other economies to alleviate commercial or political overdependence. End quote. Yet the report argues China's market size, four-decade manufacturing investment boom, and geopolitical clout also present major hurdles to diversification. Even when other economies enjoy the same attributes that made China attractive and have better security alignment with the United States, diversification can be difficult. In the report, the authors assess the potential for diversification of manufacturing and sourcing from China to other economies, whether that potential is being realized, and the reasons why or why not. They come to several working conclusions on these questions. 1. In the aggregate, diversification from China is underway, as evidenced by China's decreasing share of U.S. imports and foreign direct investment over the past 7 years. 2. Diversification has so far centered on just a few countries, Mexico and Vietnam in particular, presenting a risk of capacity constraints and rising costs, hence slowing diversification. 3. Diversification is centered in a few sectors too, textiles, electronics, and autos, and in the assembly segment rather than upstream supply chains. In short, firms on the move are still relying on their China-based manufacturing or sourcing for inputs, and broader migration will only happen in stages over a longer period. 4. U.S. trade diversification and investment diversification often don't match. The change in the composition of U.S. imports is often not driven by U.S. FDI, but by non-U.S. firms, not least of which, ironically, are Chinese and Taiwanese. 5. Beyond Mexico and Vietnam, like-minded nations can be diversification winners, despite higher cost structures. Canada, Taiwan, Germany, and South Korea are picking up trade and FDI shares. Yet, many other security-aligned nations are not. Japan, Australia, and the Philippines are notably absent from the list of hotspots. 6. The gap between diversification potential and outcomes has many causes, but two factors stand out: availability of workforces with basic to advanced skills, and the role of high-quality cross-border economic agreements. These assets are essential both to China's success over the past 2 decades and to understanding where activity is shifting today. For instance, the US-Mexico-Canada agreement is key to why Mexico is picking up so much diversification, while China's agreements with members of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations are central to the rise of its neighbors, particularly Vietnam, as US trading partners. 7. In the potential realized diversification gaps we identify, there are opportunities to drive diversification to core U.S. partners, broaden the scope of supply chain movement beyond assembly, and align trade and FDI patterns. These opportunities require active commercial diplomacy and engagement. And 8. Reducing over-reliance on China is not impossible, as it was considered until recently. However, the economic costs and risks are real, and not all worth incurring. Analysis helps to clarify where it can be viable, even at this early stage, and where policy and government action can help to clear the path. Next up, and finally for today, yesterday, Tuesday, the European Commission and the EU issued a draft of definitive findings in its anti-subsidy probe into EVs imported from China. Now, before we cover the story, just quickly, if you're getting some value from today's episode, don't forget to the like button. Sharing and subscribing is also a big help. The channel looks like it might hit 75,000 subscribers this month. It would be amazing if we could hit that milestone. Thank you so much, everybody, for the ongoing support. The European Commission made tweaks to tariff rates for some of the PRC firms selling EVs to the Europeans, with Tesla's manufactured in China being a big winner, with its additional tariff being cut to 9% from the 20.8% mooted in July. This is an additional levy of 9% on top of existing duties of 10% applied to all foreign-made cars. EVs made by BYD, the world's biggest selling battery electric vehicle company, will face a tariff rate of 17% rather than 17.4%. For Geely-made EVs, the rate dropped from 20% to 19.7%. The definitive proposal will be voted on by the EU's 27 member states in October before being written into law for 5 years. The proposal can only be reversed if a majority of capitals vote against the duties. In an indicative vote taken in July, only 4 countries voted against them. EU officials keep signaling to the PRC that they are open to a deal if the PRC proposes something meaningful. An unnamed senior EU official expressed to Hong Kong-based South China Morning Post, for example, quote, "The EU is open to reaching an alternative solution on the position of the duties that would be effective and WTO compatible. It would align with WTO rules and provide a solution to the problems we find." End quote. The same day, Tuesday, China's Commerce Ministry said the investigation was an act of, quote, "unfair competition," expressing that the EU, quote, "abused the method of sampling to treat different types of Chinese companies differently and distorted the results of the investigation. China firmly opposes and is highly concerned about the final ruling." End quote. The Chinese Chamber of Commerce to the EU said it was in, quote, "firm opposition," end quote, to the tariffs, and that there was not, quote, "sufficient evidence," end quote, to show that the European EV industry would be affected by Chinese imports. Adding, quote, "the competitiveness of electric vehicles made in China is not driven by subsidies, but by factors such as industrial scale, comprehensive supply chain advantages, and intense market competition." End quote. As we have discussed in previous videos, though these points are valid, several high-profile reports over the last several months have also showcased that Chinese EVs have enjoyed hundreds of billions of dollars in state subsidies. We remember in a June report, Scott Kennedy, a China specialist at the US-based Center for Strategic and International Studies, found that, conservatively, China's electric vehicle industry received at least $231 billion in government subsidies and aid from 2009 through to the end of last year. That is equal to 18.8% of total sales. On a per-vehicle basis, support has fallen from $13,860 in 2018 to just under $4,600 in 2023. But Kennedy warned that Chinese EVs also boast quality improvements, writing, quote, "Chinese EVs have benefited from massive industrial policy support, and their quality is improving, making them attractive to domestic and international consumers. An effective response by the US, Europe, and others must take account of both facts. If Chinese EVs were pieces of junk, then they would not be a serious challenge to the rest of the world's automakers. In general, Western automakers and governments have dilly-dallied and not been aggressive enough." End quote. Okay, that is today's episode of China Update. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching. Have a good Wednesday, and I will see you all tomorrow.